It's actually a lengthy study in terms of how much material it has. I know some folks like to have something to study and prepare, and so that's kind of the way that study will work. I'm going to give you 3 lessons at a time. If you are the kind of person that just kind of likes to have the whole thing up front, I didn't have any way to bind enough of them and or have binders for enough of them to do them all that way. But if you would like a whole set that you could put in your own binder at home, maybe that you have to carry back and forth, I'd be glad to provide that for you. In fact, I can give a few of those out tonight if you're interested in that. But otherwise, I'll just, every couple of weeks, I'll put the next 3 out, As soon as we get on the 3rd lesson of whatever set we're on, if you understand what I mean, then I'll put the next 3 out, and I'll do it that way. So you can have it either way you would like it. It's time-consuming and expensive to do those all the time, and so that's why if you are going to take a whole set, then please take care of it. Don't come back a week later and say, I need another one, or I need another one, or I need another one, because it's more the time-consuming part's not all that expensive to print, but it is time-consuming to go through all that. So anyway, those are my thoughts as it relates to that. Let's get into Zephaniah chapter 1. But before we get into Zephaniah 1, let me talk to you a little bit about Zephaniah and the historical background as it relates to his prophecy. When you think about Zephaniah, he states in verse 1 of chapter 1, the word of the Lord which came unto Zephaniah, the son of Cushai, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. And so what we have here for us is a nice, concise period of time that we can kind of understand when it is that Zephaniah is prophesying. Josiah prophesied. By the way, how old was Josiah, when he started? He's 8 years old, okay? You imagine that, an 8-year-old king, but that's what he was. He was 8 years old when he began to reign. I believe he reigned somewhere around 640 to about 612. And so that gives us a basic block of time in which this prophecy came from Josiah, or in the days of Josiah. But I want you to think with me just for a couple of minutes here about the backdrop of that so that we can kind of understand it. And that's going to require us to go into 2 Chronicles chapter 33. So go back into your Old Testaments here for a minute, a little further than Zephaniah, and go back into 2 Chronicles chapter 33. One of the things that I've been trying to do is make sure we understand the historical backdrop behind the prophet in the time period in which he's prophesying. And so in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, I could read almost all of it to you just to help you appreciate all of this. But let me try to condense it a little bit. So you have King Hezekiah. Was he good or bad? He's pretty much good, right? Not perfect, but considered a good king. And quality things happened under the rule of Hezekiah. Who came after him? That's right. Manasseh comes next. Good or bad? Really bad, right? Maybe the worst of all the kings. Manasseh, really, really bad. Now let's look at him. Manasseh was 12. Okay? Manasseh's 12 years old, verse 1 of 2 Chronicles 33, when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years. When you think about that. So from 12 years old to 67 years old. Hate sitting math work for once. 67 years old, right? That's a long period of time for him to reign. Some guys don't barely reign a month, and he reigns 55 years, but what's the sad part about that? The sad part is he reigned for 55 years. He had 55 years of ruin over the nation and over the people. 55 years to undo everything Hezekiah had done. 55 years to re-engage the people in idolatry and borrowing from the nations round about them. His evil, notice verse 2, which was evil, he did that which is evil in the sight of the Lord, like unto the abomination of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. God drove out the idolatrous people from the promised land so his people could come in there and inhabit that And instead of coming in there and living the purity that God would desire, they ended up adopting the behaviors of the nations around them at various times. Manasseh, one of the worst at that, as he built again the high places, which Hezekiah, his father, had broken down. He reared up altars for Balaam, made groves, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. Manasseh did not learn anything, apparently, from Hezekiah. Now, just for time's sake, jump down to verse 10. Verse 9 actually tells us he made them do worse than the heathen whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. Verse 10, and the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they would not hearken. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Syria, which took Manasseh among the thorns and bound him with fetters and carried him to Babylon. And when he was in affliction, he besought the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers and prayed unto him. And he was entreated of him and heard his supplication and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord, he was God. Now, Manasseh is an interesting story, right? Because he, as a king, he's pitiful. He's wreaked tremendous havoc upon God's people because of the choices and decisions and the way that he led. But then God sends him off into captivity for a little while, and he hits rock bottom, and he what? Apparently. Yeah, he turns to the Lord. He repents and confesses and acknowledges. The problem is the havoc had been wrought. The challenges he brought. I don't deny at all that this Manasseh could find penitence, and I don't deny at all that he might individually be able to reconcile his relationship with Jehovah. That appears to be what's happening with him and God. The problem is that the difficulties that he created are going to be hard to overcome. But he begins the process. Takes away the strange gods, the idol out of the house of the Lord, and all the things that he had brought into the temple that shouldn't have been there. He's trying to get them cleaned out. And he repaired the altar of the Lord in verse 16, and sacrificed thereon peace offerings and thank offerings, and commanded Judah to serve the Lord God of Israel. Verse 17, nevertheless, the people did sacrifice still in the high places, yet unto the Lord their God only. So, Manasseh has some level of success. But there's a difference between coming back partway and completely. And though he gets them to quit in some senses worshiping other gods, where can't he get them out of? Yeah, well, the locations, right? Where were they supposed to be coming to worship and honor the Most High God? Get to Jerusalem, right? Get to the temple. Get in Jerusalem. That's the place of worship. That's where you're supposed to be. And so he gets them to start thinking about Jehovah God again and desiring to worship Jehovah God again, but they're not ready to make the commitment to go down to Jerusalem and do all that, or up to Jerusalem, I should say. You always go up no matter where you're coming from. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic as it relates to him. Skip down to verse 21. So Manasseh dies. They buried him in his own house, and Amon, his son, reigned in his stead. Amon was 20 and 2 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. But he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, as did Manasseh his father. For Amon sacrificed unto all the carved images which Manasseh his father had made, and served them. So I want you to think about this for a minute. So Amon was 22 or 22 years old when he begins to reign. So if Manasseh reigned for 55 years, so for all of Amon's life, Manasseh's been in charge of the people. He's 22 years old. Obviously, he could have had the benefit of witnessing his father's penitence at the end, but it appears that he also had been influenced by the early part of who his father was, and that seems to be coming out in Ammon. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, humbled not himself before the Lord, as Manasseh his father finally did, and humbled himself, but Ammon trespassed more and more. So Manasseh, one of the worst. Ammon, he doubles down, if you will. I shouldn't be using gambling terms, I suppose. He more and more, let's use scriptural terms, more and more, he says. Ammon begins to bring evil to the people. And his servants conspired against him and slew him in his own house. You act evil, you live evil, you surround yourself with evil, bad things happen. And that's what's happened to Ammon. He surrounds himself with evil people, and the next thing you know, they turn on him and slay him in his own house. But the people of the land slew all them that had conspired against King Ammon. So those it's awful. And the people of the land made Josiah, his son, king in his stead. One more chapter, just a couple of verses. Chapter 34, 2 Chronicles, verse 1. So Josiah, time period in which Zephaniah comes on the scene, was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the ways of David his father, and declined neither to the right hand nor to the left. Now, remind you of all that history to ask you this interesting question. You would maybe think that in the time period of Josiah, when you've got a good king, he's going to reign for 31 years, he's bringing back positive things towards the Lord in order for Judah, and Zephaniah is prophesying during that reign, you might think that Zephaniah's prophecy would be what kind? Good or bad? Right, you would think good, right? That maybe, but is it? No. By the time Josiah comes on the scene, God had seen all the evil he was going to tolerate. He'd been patient. He lets Judah stay a little longer because once in a while you run into a good king. You know, Hezekiah comes on, does good. Manasseh turns right around, returns the people, shows some penitence, but his son doesn't learn anything. Ammon comes on the scene for 2 years, takes the people right back into treachery. Josiah comes on the scene. He tries to restore them back again. And then you're going to have a couple of not so good kings after that. And the difficulties will come. So Zephaniah is prophesying even in a time period when the nation is at least being led in the right ways. But it appears, though, by this stage that the judgment is set. And the prophecy of Zephaniah will speak both to Judah and to the nations that mistreated Judah. It's kind of an interesting piece of history and prophecy. Because on one side he talks about the condemnation that's going to come to Judah because of their behaviors, but then he turns around and says, but God hasn't forgot about what these other nations did as well in relationship to His people. That's a historical backdrop. Now, you think, Brian, you just spent 15 minutes on a historical backdrop. How are you going to cover these 3 chapters of Zephaniah? Well, I'm going to do it in a way that I've not typically done in a Bible class setting, but I'm going to help you a little bit. I put together just an outline as we go through the book that'll help us see the message without having to read verse by verse by verse by verse. And so keep your Bibles handy because you'll need them. And I'm going to show you scriptures on the screen as well. But let's look. So we're talking about this book of Zephaniah, and we already mentioned 640 to 612. You might see a slightly different number now and then as it relates to him. But that's the basic time period. So we've already studied the historical background. I want you to notice in verses 2 through 6 of chapter 1, he basically says judgment is coming to Judah. And that's what those verses are about. Let me share a couple of them with you. Notice verse 2. God says through the prophet, I will utterly consume all things from off the land. That's the frustration level God has reached. And when the judgment comes, God says, I'm coming and I will consume it all. God's overwhelming destruction that He plans to bring in condemnation is going to be difficult. Jump to verse 6. And them that are turned back from the Lord, and those that have not sought the Lord, nor inquired for Him, will be punished. God has been begging them, right? And on one side, the nation is going to face the judgment of God, and they're not going to escape that. There's been too much history, too much difficulty involved. So God basically has been repeatedly saying, through all these prophets that we've studied that are speaking to Judah, and Israel for that matter, that the judgment is coming. It's on the horizon. By the way, I should have mentioned this in our timeline conversation. Temple falls at about when? Anybody know what year roughly? Not trying to trap you, just giving you a chance in case you looked at that. About 586, okay? I believe is the right time period, and I could pull up my chart, but I'm going to trust my memory here for a second. I believe the temple falls roughly around 58. So this prophecy, here's the point I want to make. This prophecy's coming in that 25 to 50 year window prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. So in one sense you might say, well, that's still a few years off, but we're getting ever so close, right? We're getting closer and closer and closer to the time period in which that destruction will ultimately occur. And so though there may have a good king, and though they may be turning some, apparently there's enough still among the nation that God has defined as those that had not turned back and followed Him again. Those who have not sought the Lord, nor inquired for Him. They haven't sought after Him, haven't looked for Him, haven't inquired about what He would desire from them. And so the judgment is on the way. And then He describes that judgment in verse 7 through 18 of chapter 1 as the day of the Lord. And we've spoken in various classes within various studies. The day of the Lord is simply a fixed period of time or a moment in time in which God brings some kind of judgment, consequence, difficulty, or even a positive thing. It's not always a reference to the second coming of Christ. That's the main point that we kind of have to make sure we understand. That not every time the Bible uses the phrase day of the Lord is it a direct reference to the second coming of Christ. It could be any kind of judgment that God is bringing towards any circumstance. Could be defined as the day of the Lord. And what's interesting, Zephaniah 1, 7 through 18 defines it that it is at hand, 25 to 50 years away. Are we? It's at hand. Right? How many of you in here are over the age of 25? How many of you double 25? How fast did the 25 to 50 go? I can speak to that one. It goes really fast. Now maybe you're sitting there at 75 going, Brian, you ain't seen nothing yet. Right? This is coming, okay? It's at hand. You know, we're not talking about centuries away any longer. We're not talking about hundreds of years away anymore. This judgment of God is drawing ever so close. It's on the horizon. And it's time for them to think very soberly about that fact. God had given them some reprieve, been patient, much longer than He was with Israel, but the day of the Lord is at hand. Let's notice some passages from this segment. Verse 7. Notice here, still in chapter 1. For the day of the Lord, as we already mentioned, is at hand. Notice verse 8. He will punish all such that are clothed with strange apparel. What do you think He means by that? It's Halloween. We've seen some strange things out there, right? Right? Is that what He's talking about? That just people are dressing funny? Yeah. They were doing everything, not just to borrow their religion, not just to borrow their idols or their cult. They were borrowing clear to the way they were appearing. Even though God had given them some instructions about their appearance and certain rules and regulations about that, particularly the priests. But they were doing everything they could to look like the world around them. Has that changed? Not really. Yeah, we still struggle at times with wanting to look like the world that's around us. But He said the punishment's coming. And to those who are strange apparel, those who may be borrowing the apparel of these idolatrous worshipers around about them, God says punishment's on the way. Notice verse 12. He would punish those who say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will He do evil. What's that phrase mean? He can't do anything. That's the mindset. That is exactly the way our world is. When you think about it, how many people do you see kneel down or offer some token expression to Jehovah, but in their mind and in their hearts, they really believe He is powerless really to do anything? They want to believe in a God. They want to believe in something. But the minute you give that God authority or power or ability, then I become accountable, and I don't want to be accountable. And so I like my God to not be either way. He's neither evil nor good. He can't accomplish either one. Because the minute He can, now that changes the way I have to think about Him. And that's the way they were. They had relegated their God, Jehovah God, to a God who was incapable. Not omnipotent, but impotent is the way they looked at Him. Do you have thought? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Zach. I thought I saw you. Yeah. Yeah. Bring this judgment. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, Zane, what we struggle with sometimes is we make the assumption that the only way God can impact things is the supernatural, the miraculous. And that's not true. And God has demonstrated throughout the narrative of Scripture that He can impact things in all kinds of ways without ever having to defy natural situations. Though He did defy natural situations at times, He doesn't have to have an impact. And you're right. I think sometimes we almost can think of God as being powerless because He doesn't function in the same as He did at another time. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not always as easily defined or seen. When you take a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread and you feed 5,000 plus, that's a visible manifestation of the power of God. But I don't think I'm out on a limb here by saying the majority of what God does probably it isn't seen like that. But the effects are there and they're real. Yeah. Yeah. And that was part of the fallacy the apostles particularly Paul tried to challenge people to realize. To embrace who God was without having to see some physical manifestation of it. So those who try to say He's powerless, the punishment's coming. Verse 14. I knew I had these in my charts. I should have just waited. The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hasteth greatly. And think about that. He wants to make sure it is near. It is near. It hasteth greatly. 3 ways to say the same thing. Okay? Anytime you repeat yourself for a reason. Emphasis. Right? I know the school teacher would get that, right? Emphasis. You repeat things for emphasis' sake. Or if you feel like it's not getting through. Or if you feel like you're being ignored. There's a vast number of reasons why you might repeat yourself. But all of it boils down to the need in your mind, or God's mind, the prophet's mind, a need for emphasis. 25 to 50 years roughly away, if my timeline's right. roughly. If you talk about the 640 to 612, 586, it could have been any point in time in that 640 to 612 that he said this. So that's how I'm doing that math. But it's coming, and it's getting closer and closer every step of the way. Notice verse 18 of chapter 1. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. By the way, the principle that wealth can get you by, B-Y or B-U-Y, either way you want to look at it, but that wealth somehow can help you escape difficulty, that principle has never really changed. In the days of the prophet Zephaniah, he's telling them, I don't care how many bags of gold you got, I don't care how many bags of silver you've got. When God decides to bring this condemnation and judgment, it won't be able to buy you security or refuge or safety. Your gold and silver will not help you. Fast forward a little bit. When Jesus spoke about treasures of earth and treasures of heaven, He said, lay up your treasure in heaven where neither moth or rust could destroy. Right? Wealth won't help you. Let me give you another statement that Jesus made in relationship to this same concept. Jesus, in talking to some folks about the kingdom of heaven, He talked about how it was easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than to enter into the kingdom of heaven. What was the response of the poor people? Then who can be saved? Because the poor had already fixed in their minds, in the days of Jesus, in the days of Zephaniah, they had determined in their minds that the rich can have whatever they want. And when it came to even salvation, and Jesus said that the rich man, it's easier for him to get through the eye of a needle than it is for the camel to get through the eye of a needle. Then, well, you can get the rich man through there if you want to, but the camel to get through the eye of the needle than for the rich man to go into the kingdom of heaven. The people's response to that was, well, nobody can be saved because anybody that's got money is able to do anything. Fast forward. Here we are, 2018. Has that mindset changed? No. I mean, I'm not going to ask you for a show of hands, but just stop and think. How many times in your own mind or in a moment in time where some situation has come and you've said to yourself, the rich always have all the brains, right? They get off on legalities. They have better opportunities. And that mindset hasn't changed. But Zephaniah, Jehovah, Jesus, the apostles, all of them, collectively have been trying to warn people, don't trust it. Don't trust it. And don't be jealous of those who are trusting it, because the consequence will ultimately come. They may seem to be faring well, and they may. They may fare well the entire existence they have on earth, but they will have had their reward. Earthly. If they put their faith and trust in riches. And so God says it's not going to help you. It won't help you when this challenge comes. Comments, thoughts about chapter 1. All right, so keep moving through. Chapter 2, in verses 1 through 15, which I think is all the chapter. Judah's enemies will be punished. Judah, you might have a good king right now, but there's too much history and challenge here. The condemnation's coming. The judgment's drawing nearer and nearer. It's hasting to arrive. But he also wants to make sure the nations round about don't get any ideas that simply because Judah is going to be judged that they somehow will skate on by without any difficulties. Notice with me a couple verses. Verse 3. Seek ye the Lord, all ye meek of the earth, which have wrought His judgment. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. It may be ye shall be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. So I think verse 2, if you notice, it mentions the nations. And you can appreciate the fact that he's giving them an opportunity too. He's saying, seek judgment, seek righteousness, seek meekness. And maybe, if you'll do that, if you'll seek the qualities that God's been looking for, remember Micah's prophecy? When they were questioning, they're wondering, what are we going to do about all this? Should we get us 10,000 rams to sacrifice? Should we send our firstborn to be offered unto God? And what God say to them? I'm looking for mercy, justice. What was the third one? Yeah, I believe it was humility. I think I'd have to go back and look myself now. I'm questioning my own mind. But the point I'm trying to drive at is God's offering the same opportunity to the nations. He's saying to these other nations, you've got an opportunity. Chapter 3 will be talking about how that happens, by the way, through the Savior, Jesus, and the calling upon all nations to come unto Him. But maybe the Lord's anger won't find you if you'll behave and return or seek rather with meekness the righteousness of God. Verse 8. He says, I have heard the reproach of Moab and the revilings of the children of Ammon, whereby they have reproached my people. God had heard about very specifically certain areas and people and nations and groups that had created calamities for Judah and the difficulties they had presented. Notice verse 9. Surely Moab shall be as Sodom, and the children of Ammon as Gomorrah. He talks about the Ethiopia. He talks about some other regions and places in the context of chapter 2. But it's interesting. He singles Moab and Ammon out, and he says, what kind of destruction's coming to them? Yeah, the same kind that Sodom and Gomorrah. And that, yeah. Completely desolate from that point on. God is going to bring that kind of consequence to these who have brought reproach against Judah. It's really an interesting set of circumstances in some ways, because God uses the veracity of certain nations to bring the judgment He needs to bring against His own people, but He doesn't on the other side say, well, I'm going to excuse your behaviors because you're happen to be serving a purpose I need. He holds them just as accountable for their behaviors and choices. And the challenges that Moab and Ammon had brought are going to be met with pretty severe consequences. He specifically mentions Assyria at the end of this narrative as well. Let's read these last few verses. And He will stretch out His hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation, and dry like a wilderness, and flocks shall lie down in the midst of her. All the beasts of the nations, both the cormorant and the bittern, shall lodge in the upper lintels of it. Their voice shall sing in the windows. Desolation shall be in the thresholds, for He shall uncover the cedar work. This is the rejoicing city that dwelt carelessly, that said in her heart, I am. Who's that expression expressly should be held for? And Jehovah. Jehovah is the I am. Right? Remember when He tells Moses, asked him, who shall I tell the people sent me? I am. Tell him the I am has sent you. And so I believe there's some reference here. When the Assyrians had determined, because of their great successes and their ability to conquer other nations, they had become the I am. We're the ones that are the most powerful. And they're rejoicing over it, but they're being careless in the meantime. And there is none beside me. I am, and there is none beside me. When God taught Moses in Deuteronomy, He told them, you tell the people that I am the Lord thy God, and besides me there is none else. Same phrase. They had determined they were the I am. They had determined they were the one there was none else, or is none else. Those phrases belong to God. How is she become a desolation, a place for beasts to lie down? Every one that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his hand. And they thought they had accomplished so much that it could never be taken away from them. But that carelessness would ultimately bring their demise. That arrogance of we are the I am. That arrogance like there is none other nation like us. We're so great and so wonderful that nothing could ever challenge us or cause difficulty for us. And he said eventually people will walk by and hiss and wave their hand and mock at the very scene of what Assyria had become. Yeah. Yep. And it. Go ahead, Brian. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. And every time men have done that, they create consequence and challenge for themselves. Yep. And anytime man has tried to elevate himself to godlike status, God addresses it and has throughout history. And that could be any nation at any point in time in history that could do the same. Questions about chapter 2? All right, so then let's look at chapter 3 and just get the sense of the message of the prophet. So, verses 1 through 8 of chapter 3, he talks about judgment on Jerusalem and the nation. And there's some specifics, I think, that we can look at that will help us kind of appreciate the message of the prophet. Verse 2. She obeyed not the voice. She received not correction. She trusted not in the Lord. She drew not near to her God. This is the reasoning that Zephaniah is offering to them as to why the condemnation and consequence is coming. And number one, he said, because you didn't obey. You didn't follow the instructions you were given. You obeyed not the voice of God. And anytime God tried to correct you and put you back on the right path, you ignored it. You never trusted Him. And because of that, you never drew near to Him. All of those things will keep you getting further and further away from God. All of those things will create a circumstance where you distance yourself away from God. And when we reject the voice of Jehovah and don't listen to the correction and the instruction and the reproof that often comes, and difficulty arrives. Notice verses 6 and 7. In verse 6, he mentions this, he will cut off the nations. And then fast forward into verse 7, then I said, instruction, so their dwelling should not be cut off. Howsoever I punished them, but they rose early and corrupted all their doings. It seems to me what the prophet's trying to convey to us that God was saying is He brought condemnation, He brought judgment, He brought consequence, He gave them instruction, He gave them correction, He would reprove them, He would do anything and everything He could think of. And in a sense, God's saying, surely after all that they will fear me. Surely that will receive instruction. After the condemnation, after the consequences arrive, surely you'll receive instruction then. And then I wouldn't have to cut them off. If they'd be willing to listen and adhere and pay attention and embrace the instruction and counsel I'm giving them, I wouldn't have to cut them off. And surely, if I just give them a little taste of that judgment, if I just give them a little taste of that correction, fear will come upon them and they'll make the changes necessary. But they rose early and corrupted all. They ignored Him from the start. They rose up early, rejected anything that God had shared with them, and made corruption out of themselves because of it. But God says there still can be some hope and restoration. Yes, God had sent prophet after prophet. He'd warned, challenged, tried to correct, reproved, rebuked. God did everything. And in His mind, He thought for sure that one of these steps, one of these moments, it would eventually wake the nation up. Jerusalem would wake up to the consequences they were bringing to themselves. But it never happened. Not in enough fullness to make a real change. Couple of kings now and then, but it seemed like every time you get a good king pointing them in the right direction, the next king would bring them right back. And so they never had any long-term consistency in righteous behavior. Though God would have chosen not to cut them off, though God would have preferred not to have to bring condemnation against them, they left Him no choice. And by the way, correct me if I'm wrong in thinking this, but I think sometimes we get in our minds that this is the way it had to happen. The only thing that had to happen in terms of the promises of God is that through Abraham's seed, what? Jesus would come and all the nations of the earth would be blessed. This could have been a wonderful time period from the moment that the promise was made to Abraham until God decides to fulfill the moment in time that Jesus would come. But because they continued to make bad choices and decisions and put leaders in front of them that led them into idolatrous and wicked ways, God was repeatedly bringing judgment, consequence, trying to get them back on track until ultimately Jesus would arrive and real hope and restoration could come. Notice verse 9 of chapter 3. That they may all call outside nations and Judah as well, Israel, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve Him with one consent. God says there's no hope to save you as you are. He's not going to save the nations round about them that have brought condemnation, like Moab and Ammon, like Assyria. He's not going to restore them and help them as nations. He's not going to allow Judah to continue to exist in this fashion that they've been portraying. Israel's got its consequence. But He says there is a time period coming where I'll bring everybody into one consent. One recognition of Jesus and the salvation that He offers. And they can all do what? That they may all, verse 9, call upon the name of the Lord. It's exactly what the New Testament writers went about preaching and teaching. Whosoever call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. The importance of appealing to the authority of God for salvation. There was hope for restoration. There was hope. He didn't leave them hopeless. But that hope was going to come years later, and it was going to come in the form of Jesus, and it was going to come in the form of a spiritual kingdom. And so He says in verse 14, "Sing, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem." Salvation was coming. Hope was on the way. And that hope would be found in the promises that God had made. Notice verse 17. "The Lord thy God in the midst of thee is mighty. He will save." I love definitive terms, right? He gives them a tremendous anchor of hope here. The Lord thy God is in the midst. He hasn't left. You left Him. You left Him. And He had to bring consequence because of that. He brought justice and judgment because of that. But He's going to bring restoration. And He, in the form of Jesus, will be literally in the midst of them. In the midst of thee is mighty, and He will save. Jesus ultimately brings the salvation they needed, the hope they needed, the strength they needed. He will be the great witness, if you will. He'll be the great example before them of how mighty and strong and powerful that God is. And Zephaniah is telling them, sure, something that's going to come sometime later. None of them would personally experience it. But it's coming. And it's been the message of all these prophets thus far. "For I will make you a name and a praise among all people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord." No greater kingdom ever founded than the one founded in the blood of the Lamb. No greater kingdom ever established than the one established by Jesus. And His name is worthy of praise and honor. No, you're as a nation, Judah, you're not going to be like you once were. But if you'll come and call upon the name of the Lord, if you'll serve Him with one consent, if you'll join yourself into the promises that Jesus is offering, if you'll appreciate that the Lord has come in the midst of you and is offering salvation and hope, if you'll embrace that when the time comes. The hope here is not necessarily that the people, you would be encouraged as a nation to realize God isn't going to leave you completely and there's something still out here on the horizon for you as a nation. But also the hope would be that when Jesus arrives on the scene, the people would look back to what? They'd look back to these prophecies and say to themselves, this is the hope God talked about. This is the salvation God talked about. This is the one who's walking in the midst of us with strength that God talked about through the prophets. Unfortunately, that wasn't their response. In fact, they responded to Jesus just like their fathers had responded to the prophets. It's really sad when you think about it. Can you just stop for a moment and imagine? You've been given the playbook, right? You've been given the story before it happens. And they're still not ready for it when Jesus comes. They have been allowed a glimpse into the restoration and salvation that God was going to provide through the Savior. It has been prophesied about over and over and over again. And as they saw Jesus and witnessed who He was and what He did and where He was from and how He was born and all the things that they could have pointed to and looked back to all these prophets, they should have easily concluded this is exactly what we've been waiting for. But seemingly only a remnant among the Jews of their day would embrace what the prophets have been saying for a long time was coming. Last second thoughts or comments about the book of Zephaniah. You didn't think I'd do that, did you? All right, so Lord willing, let's take a break from the minor prophets heading into next Sunday for a period of time. Like I said, those worksheets are on the table in 3 lessons at a time.